So what does the Korean government do to, in a sense, enhance tourism, the experience, but also the number of tourists coming to Korea? So through this lecture, I hope you'll be able to at least slightly improve your ability to discuss the role of the Korean government in heritage policies and how that may impact the kind of foreign relationships it has with countries in the region. You may be aware of what UNESCO does and what its significance is, but it might be worth just reiterating that UNESCO in Korea has an enormous reputation. Korea has always dedicated itself to UNESCO's activities quite strongly, and it is considered quite an accolade of, I would say, achievement to have anything recognized by UNESCO, which is international, is not associated with a particular nation per se, and that makes it rather powerful. It's kind of universally acknowledged, whatever UNESCO acknowledges. So are you aware of the heritage in your own country that is listed as World Heritage by UNESCO? And what does the government in your own country do to preserve and promote that heritage? It is worth considering, and not just to compare your own country with Korea, but simply to consider what policy may be best in not only preserving heritage, but also to promote it. Now in Korea, the system of the heritage preservation was very much driven by Japanese legislation. And that in turn was very likely driven in part by kind of a global kind of increasing interest in the cost, the value of collectibles, which started already in the 19th century through world fairs. Suddenly Japanese were becoming aware that having certain items actually meant having something of incredible value, and not just to themselves, but also to foreigners. And then you see that this market for kind of antiques in Korea starts to develop very fast also, even before annexation of Korea in 1910. So when the Japanese take over Korea in 1910 and colonize Korea, one of the things they noticed is that there's a lot of looting, and including by Japanese. And so they need legislation. The same applies to Japan as well. And so when you look at the legislation of the kind of protection of tangible heritage in Japan and Korea, you see that laws are constantly developed to ensure their protection. Although it must be said that in Korea many things were still damaged also by Japanese, and many items were also in a sense looted by Americans kind of right after liberation and even before. So total protection has not been succeeded through this legislation, although legislation has since developed considerably, and it is much harder now to even try to take old things home overseas. Even when you pay for it properly in a shop and follow all the rules, there's all kinds of limits to that now, which is a good thing. So one of the interesting things today is that we have a lot of kind of treasures in Korea, both tangible and intangible. The government recognizes a lot of heritage around us here, and part of those treasures are in the very center of Seoul. Some of the numbers 1 to 10, for example, there's many of them that exist right here. And that numbering is problematic, of course, because it kind of implies that number 1 is more important than number 2, is more important than number 3, and so on. However, when this system was devised, what the Japanese did was actually just start in the center of town and then work their way around through the city and then around the city, etc. So the numbering was more kind of chronological than a reflection of importance. And so they've kind of kept it, but it's not very helpful, because a number 1 will always sound more important than the number 100, but you do need a number in essentially. And in the past, high school children in Korea were taught to memorize the numbers 1 to 20, I believe. Something to be proud of. So over the years, the Korean government has tried very hard to set up a system that would protect both tangible treasures as well as intangible ones. And so they protected buildings, they protected items, pieces of clothing. They might have a way of making food, so the utensils used to make food, and then the way in which you sing certain songs from a particular region, etc., etc. So all those things were eventually documented and then discussed, and if they could find good enough artists to continue a particular tradition and pass it on to a future generation, then that might be listed and approved by the Minister of Culture and added to a long list of tangible or intangible cultural properties. And yet it of course faced all kinds of issues. It is not easy to find people who are capable of teaching, for example. They might be fantastic dancers or singers, but they might just be very bad at teaching others. That is a problem. And when you're thinking about tangible items, sometimes things just deteriorate and there's very little you can do. So it may be an old tree that you wish to preserve, or even a site, a particular view that you wish to preserve, but then you may end up dealing with private property that makes things very difficult. Or you may be dealing with a tree that dies and dramatically changes a particular site. Sometimes a site is destroyed by a small earthquake or something like that. And so the administration had to constantly adapt and make adjustments, and I think they've done a wonderful job despite all those challenges, because nowadays there's so many of these properties that are actually being cherished by the majority population here in Korea, and they're recognized overseas too. One of the things that has made things rather complicated, though, is the efforts made to also get people overseas to recognize Korean treasures. It has been fairly straightforward trying to get Koreans to embrace particular traditions, for example, but when you try to do that overseas, it's much harder. So one of the things that, for example, Korea did in the 1980s and 90s is whenever they sent performers of traditional performing arts overseas, they always included pansori. And although pansori is a beautiful art, it can be quite difficult to truly understand and even appreciate, because it is so different from everything else out there. They could have, for example, included folk song singers. There's a lot of beautifully sung folk songs here in Korea that represent particular regional styles, but they weren't included. It was always pansori singers. And of course, a number of people did really embrace that tradition and became more interested in Korea as a result. But whether they really liked it, I'm not always sure. I think folk songs are, in a sense, a better step, first step, before you move to the very accomplished tradition of pansori. A personal opinion. And so another thing that's happened more recently is that certain traditions were attempted to be added to the list of UNESCO that then existed also in different forms in the region being East Asia. And then it ended up becoming a bit of a competition. So it started with China successfully getting UNESCO to recognize Arirang as part of the kind of the Koreans living in and around the Yangon prefecture. So sung by Koreans living in China, which is fair. But of course, it's not the thing you want to see happening when it's not even recognized as a Korean treasure first. And then, therefore, South Korea quickly made efforts to have Arirang also added to the list. And then North Korea woke up and thought it should also submit their version of the song, which again UNESCO did. Although the North Korean version of the song is really rather dramatically different, and it does not follow the same kind of style of singing. The South Korean one seems to be, in a sense, more rooted in tradition, an old tradition, than the North Korean one. So ultimately what this kind of competition now that is constantly taking place over who in East Asia gets the next item on the list, what this means is it's a battle over IP rights, over copyright. Because one of the problems we face now is that a lot of traditions we see in Korea exist in some form also in China and in Japan and in Taiwan. And so you then have to wonder what that means in terms of ownership. Yes, I think they are all their own unique selves as an item, but they are, of course, linked. They're not unique in a sense. They are developments of ideas and notions that existed at some point in one place and then moved out. And so that makes the implications of this new development interesting, because what does this mean to tourism? I guess there's a couple of things to consider. First of all, I think it is important and perhaps useful to tourists to understand how something developed. To say if something like a dragon dance exists in one country as well as another, I think it is nice for a tourist to see what the differences are, rather than ignoring the other version. I think it would be nice for tourists to understand the differences and why it's special in this particular place, wherever you are in East Asia. Educate, in a sense, the tourists. I think that would be nice. At the same time, though, if you're a tourist and you come to Korea and you see the word heritage or cultural property number so and so too many times, I think there is a risk that the tourist becomes tired of seeing it too much, and then the value, the added value of that recognition may wear off a little bit. So it's not entirely without risks, I think. In terms of its effect on tourism, you can have too much of a good thing, in other words. To the Korean government, I think this competition, if you like, poses two other problems. One is a legal problem, because in the future we may see a lot of similar battles being fought, and it puts pressure on diplomacy over what particular word you want, for example, China to use for your kimchi. And of course, Chinese people enjoy saying bao tai or something for something that is created in Korea. And Koreans may have tried recently to get the Chinese to adopt a particular Chinese word for their kimchi to indicate the difference, because in China we also have pickled cabbage. The Koreans would argue that it's different in terms of flavor and the procedure, the kind of the way in which you make it. Chinese would say, well, that may be true, but it's similar. And we have quite a range of varieties as well. It's better not to enter a discussion of this, because it is endless. So the legal implications of this are a bit ominous. A second complication is that the cost of maintaining all these cultural properties in Korea is quite significant as well. And when we don't have a very strong economy, because, for example, the birth rate in Korea is very low, then you do need to wonder what the costs are of maintaining this very large, broad system of heritage preservation in Korea, and whether the people can carry the cost of it, and whether tourism brings in enough revenue to, in a sense, support that cost. I'm not sure. I hope it is, but when the effect of Hallyu wears off, the cost may become too great. So finally, I suppose what is the key issue here is that foreigners come to see Korean heritage, and it is indeed wonderful to see the Korean government making so many efforts to support that. But there are some aspects that I think make this a difficult thing to continue doing, perhaps in the next 10 to 20 years. It's the cost, it's the legal implications, and it's the fact that perhaps at some point there's too many of them, and then the actual value of an individual item may be decreased as a result.